Hi, everyone, and welcome to this webinar. Is the tide really turning against renewables? Thanks, everyone, for joining and for joining on a very hot day for some people. I know that all of us would prefer to be outside in the sunshine right now, so thank you very much. My name is Flick Monk, and I am the Community and Public Energy Campaigner at Platform, a small campaigning collective that brings together workers and communities to create new liberatory systems that tackle injustice and climate breakdown. Just a bit of housekeeping. We are, as you could just tell, we are recording this webinar, and so if you don't want to be recorded, please keep your camera off, and also please mute your microphone during the presentations. I think most of you are already muted. Thank you. We will run for an hour. We've got three speakers who'll each speak for around 10 minutes, and then we'll have a Q&A at the end. So if you have questions, which are very welcome, please keep them until the end. Or if you think you're going to forget them, put them in the chat and we'll pick them up when we get there. If you're having technical issues, let my colleague Ruth and Kerry know in the chat, who will try and help. But sometimes it's best to just go out and come in and see if that fixes things. Okay, I think that's all in terms of housekeeping. How we get our energy, how we pay for it, and crucially, who owns it, remain hugely controversial in our current political moment. Amidst another energy crisis sparked by yet another illegal war, global energy prices have skyrocketed, prompting fresh calls to drill for more oil and gas in the North Sea. The renewables industry is also coming under increasing fire from rural communities who are pushing back against wind farms, substations, solar farms, and transmission lines they feel are being forced upon them. There'll now, for example, be a public inquiry into the Spittal to Beauly transmission line, and Highland Council just last week formally objected to another section of the transmission line, reflecting this growing backlash. Politically, Reform have been exploiting both of these sentiments, talking up oil and gas, while also campaigning against the renewables industry in their broader anti-net zero crusade. We have a new but fairly familiar Scottish Government in place that still haven't published their long-term energy strategy. And now at the UK level, Andy Burnham enters the scene championing more of a role for the state in controlling key utilities, including energy. Amidst this social and political whirlwind, Platform, through the new Our Power Coalition, commissioned research into people's attitudes towards public ownership of the renewables industry in Scotland. Next slide, please, Kerry. In this webinar, we will share the results of this research. And we've got Cameron Garrett here from More in Common, who did the research, to talk us through the details. The results are heartening. People are sceptical of big business and want a different energy system. And we also wanted to bring in the local picture too, where the growing backlash against renewables by rural communities is, we think, a symptom of a wider system where people feel like they have very little ownership, control, or even input over renewable energy infrastructure in their local place. Claire Harris from Local Storytelling Exchange is going to take us through some totally fascinating research that her team did on the opposition to transmission lines and substations across the UK and also in Scotland. Finally, we'll hear from Rowan Aitchison from Uplift and the new Our Power campaign on how public ownership of renewables could be a big part of the answer to growing dissatisfaction of the energy system towards a more positive vision for Scotland. And we'll then facilitate a Q&A. So yeah, have your questions ready. So I'll now hand over to Cameron from More in Common to take us through the results of the research on attitudes to public energy ownership. Cameron.
Thank you, Flick, and hi everyone. My name is Cameron Garrett. I'm from More in Common. You might have heard of us. We're in the news quite a lot at the minute with all the political turmoil, but thankfully not talking about that, and instead talking about attitudes to publicly owned energy in Scotland today, based on some research we've done. So just on the next slide has some details about what we actually did. So this was back at the end of January and start of February, so just before the conflict in Iran really started, and we interviewed 1,000 people in Scotland, a representative sample there, so we can make conclusions about what the whole of Scotland thinks. And then we also conducted 3 focus groups. And today I'm just going to talk through some of the headline findings of that research. Just up front at More in Common, we have a model of how we think about the public, where we've broken people down into different segments. I'm not going to dwell on this too much today, but do reach out if you're interested to hear more. I'm just mentioning it because we do cut some of the data into these segments, but it's essentially your progressive activists, incrementalists left, and established liberals towards the left, and then you go more towards the right with rooted patriots, traditional conservatives, and dissenting disruptors. So when we asked people in the research what their top priorities were for energy policy in Scotland at the minute, um, 3 in 5 say cutting energy bills, which is unsurprising and something we've been hearing in focus groups for well over since the start of this government, really, about the cost of living and tying that to energy bills. And it's really been coming through strongly, and it's only increased since the war in Iran there. And then, secondly, second to that is making Scotland more energy independent by building Scottish clean energy companies at 45%. And whilst few people are bringing up public energy spontaneously as a top priority, when it is discussed in focus groups, there is broad support for it, and there is support for. There's an underlying sentiment that the system isn't working and something needs to change. So, just in their own words, some quotes from the cost of living. Lynette down there, why is our energy still so expensive and why is it continually growing? I mean, energy prices have not come down for long enough. People wrongly assume that people who are in poverty are the folk that don't work, and that's stereotyping. For me, my wage isn't keeping up with the cost of living and inflation. And just to pick up on that, I would say how widely this is felt across society. It's not just people who are less well off that are complaining about energy bills. It's people who you would assume should be able to afford them are complaining and picking up on how costs are spiraling there. And thankfully, renewables are seen as benefiting Scotland. When we ask people whether renewable energy investment, such as offshore wind, etc., is good for Scotland, we get 2 in 3 saying it's good, compared to just 9%, so fewer than 1 in 10 saying it's bad. So high levels of positivity and actually very low hostility towards it. When you break it down through those groups, you can see that those more left-leaning segments, support for renewable energy is actually really strong, and you have a strong base to build upon. There's nearly majority across all of them saying it's actually very good, so the most positive. And even amongst some of those right-leaning groups, so kind of rooted patriots who typically live in like red wall areas, you've got the majority saying it's good, and dissenting disruptors who are kind of shorthand for saying reform voters. You've also got the majority saying it's good for Scotland. It's these traditional conservatives who name on the tin traditionally have voted conservatives and are actually sticking with the Conservative Party, where there is more hostility towards renewables. But as you can see, across all groups apart from them, hostility isn't that high. The problem is that traditional conservatives can be quite vocal in their opposition towards it. Those people are against it, and that can kind of sometimes dominate the narrative and help undermine support for renewables. When asked what their top concerns are about the transition to renewable energy, the one that jumps out most is energy companies will use it to make a profit. And that's a sentiment that comes up quite strongly in focus groups we're doing throughout, that people just think energy companies are taking advantage of people essentially, and costs are, they don't really understand why costs are spiraling. They assume they're profiteering off them, and that's a concern that would happen if we transitioned to renewable energies. And then there's also concerns among Scottish people about people in the oil and gas industry losing their jobs in a transition, and corrupt politicians who will choose plans that do no good for the public, and that people in oil and gas industries will lose their job. When we were doing focus groups in Aberdeen South, in the build up to the by-election, that was a real concern that we were seeing coming through there, that the Conservatives capitalised upon in their winning that by-election. And across the board, political parties are not meeting the public's priorities. So few Scots trust the government or political parties to deliver on this. It's worth saying, I don't think you'll be surprised to hear that public trust in the government is at an all-time low. So it's not that surprising to see they also distrust them to protect workers in the transition to renewable power and cut energy bills there. But I think what is heartening is there is slightly more trust for the SNP rather than Labour and Reform, so the Labour government in London. And actually, whilst they're still net on balance, don't trust the SNP to increase Scotland's energy independence. I actually think when you're that close to teetering towards positive is actually very good in this landscape. So there is something positive there. But across the board, they don't think that politicians are delivering for them. So then we moved on to ask a bit more about public-owned energy and dive in a bit deeper. And on that levels of trust, public ownership can help restore some of that low levels there. And when we ask people how much they would trust different actors to develop energy infrastructure. The people that came out on top was an energy company set up by the Scottish government. So that is at 43% there. Then the Scottish government, then the SNP. And this is kind of what we see in research that Scottish people tend to believe in and favour more stuff done by the Scottish government and more distrusting of the government in Westminster, the Conservatives, and also very low levels of trust in large energy companies down there as well. Only 23% believing that they could develop energy infrastructure to benefit Scotland. So signs of positivity there that public ownership could help rebuild. And actually, we then split down about what this ownership model might look like and how people would react to a new renewable project at a local level. So we created a hypothetical new wind farm being built. And you can see on the right here, the project that gains the most support is one that's completely a public company run by their local authority, as which on average had 39 support and across all our different segments. The traditional Conservatives were the only people who didn't support it. And this generates more support than if it's a hybrid model where it's a local community group owned by a private company or a local authority and private company. I think what's worth pointing out, though, on the pure public company one is that the strength of disagreement amongst the traditional Conservatives is even stronger. So whilst overall you're getting high levels of support, those people that are against it in principle are even strongly more against it and would be more open if there was private company involvement. And then the key benefits of public energy are kind of unsurprising, more public control, more revenue to local government, and they think it can help take local concerns more seriously. Um, I think the key one here is whether it can lower bills. We hear again and again that people really want a government to do something to ease the cost of living. And if public ownership could be tied to actually lowering bills, I think that would be a huge win in how this debate can be won. Some things to watch out for here are when we ask about whether more government money will be wasted, people suspect that could happen more likely from a public owned energy company, and whether it be more inefficient and bureaucratic, people associate more with a public owned energy company. So lots of positivities there, but two watchwords and things to watch out for if you were to campaign on for this. And then more broadly, Scotland's parties are seen to be out of touch on public ownership. So on the right here, we have a scale of 0 to 10 where we ask people to say whether they were strongly in favour of public ownership or strongly in favour of privately owned energy companies. And you can see here on average, people fell out at 4. And then SNP voters were the most positive. But I think what's really interesting is Reform voters were actually more in favour of publicly owned energy companies than private energy companies. And there's a big gap in where people actually place Reform and where people assume Reform are. So there's a gap between the public perception of Reform UK and where their voters actually are, because actually their voters are more pro-public ownership than Labour voters, just marginally there, which I think would surprise a lot of the narrative we hear around this. And across the board, there's support for public-owned energy companies, whether that's run by the government, local authorities, or the UK government, much more so compared to run by a privately company there. Next slide, please. And just quickly, barriers to support are unsurprising. And if you work in this industry, I'm sure you've heard lots of these before. But it's that the private sector can actually invest more. People are heavily convinced by that the Scottish government cannot be trusted to run energy companies, and that it might lead to taxes being wasted. So some of those counter arguments that come up, we're seeing the majority of people are convinced by these. So there's something to be wary of if we go out and to persuade people that this is worthwhile and the way forward there. And I think that's me. I've just got some quotes there that flesh that out a bit more. So then, in summary, on my final slide, bills are the dominant issue. People really want that to be lowered. There's ground support for renewables, so the vast majority are in support of it. So a transition will be popular, and there's a preference for public ownership, but we should be wary because people are open to some of those counter arguments around whether it would be costly and efficient for the public. But as long as it can be tied to bills, then I think that would be the way forward in how it can help solve the cost of living. And then I think I am handing over to Claire.
I will just come in. Thanks so much, Cameron. That was really brilliant and fascinating. Loads to pick up on there in the Q&A. Yeah, we're going to now hand over to Claire from the local storytelling exchange to give us quite a different perspective from communities and how communities on the ground are feeling about renewable infrastructure rollout in Scotland. And we are, in fact, going to watch a video first. I don't know, Claire, if you want to come in and say a few words before playing this video.
No, no, that's fine. You can just kick off.
Great.
Torness will be defueled and decommissioned in the coming 5 years, and the national grid expansion means that in order to use these existing overhead power lines, they're going to build a new substation on this field behind you there. 3 years ago, the other community councillors said to me, every meeting there's somebody else coming to tell us about their stuff. They're taking over the whole business agenda. So I said, well, let's invite them all to come at the same time then.
When we heard that the substation was going to be built in the field right next to our steading, that was quite a shock. But the local community started a group, East Lothian Winds of Change, and they invited us to come and hear more about what was going on. So I got involved in that, feeling that, actually initially with the intention of objecting to it all, but once I got drawn in, I realised that we should give it more a chance and see what might come out of it all, in a positive way. You have to be the custodian of wherever you find yourself.
It is a very small project, but we're looking how we can really kickstart landscape scale nature restoration, working with local people to reconnect them to the local landscape, help them better understand how it's behaving at the moment, what the challenges are, and create a shared vision for what it could be if nature's really given a chance. One of the key opportunities we see here is because of all the energy developments, there will be lots of money coming into the area through community benefit and one-off payments. So we're wanting to try and ensure that this is used in as strategic a way as possible. It really gives us a unique opportunity in a way to really fund this project and try and restore nature across the whole area.
We have a great community who are really, everybody loves this place. It's a very special place. It's very peaceful. It's about the right development in the right place. In fact, we did a survey of the community, and the first question we asked them was what their opinion was about renewable energy, were they for or against it, and it was over 90% were in favour of renewable energy. But what you may not know is this solar farm, massive though is just one of about 14 different renewables infrastructure projects just in East Lammermuir. It's better community consultation at an earlier stage. I mean, something we found out was that this solar farm had been in sort of planning for 2 years before anyone in the community ever knew about it. So we need to have as much information, accurate information, and be informed as early as possible.
Developers, whether they like it or not, are in the game of community development from the word go when they start thinking about it through to when they decommission it and take it away again. They're part of the story, and it's better for them to work with the community because things will go more smoothly or potentially more quickly. We'll get a better design that works for the local area as well as the national grid. Or they can sit in splendid isolation and it'll be harder for everyone.
They communicated with us and made us feel part of it and that we could have a say. I'll know how many lorries are coming, and when roads are going to be closed and how long things are going to take. And I also know how things should look when it's all over. So yes, we will have quite a long period of transition, but at the end of it, we can look to something that's maybe going to be quite acceptable in the future.
So thanks for watching that. We felt we'd run it all the way through because we feel it's really powerful, and it's always nice to hear from the actual people who are living this, as well as the folk who are talking about them. So this was a result of a kind of year-long process that we've been working on at the Exchange, which involved active listening, research, journalism, deliberation processes, with communities all the way down that east coast line of the specific section of the Great Grid Upgrade from the Northeast Highlands down through Aberdeenshire and all the way down to Kent on the south coast of England. From that, we found, I guess, 4 core things, which maybe don't come as a surprise. Collaboration in place of consultation. That's what people wanted. They wanted an end to that sense of what the guys spoke about in that film, that accumulation of proposal and planning application on top of one another. People wanted to see ambition, actually. Once they got thinking about it, they wanted to see ambition, just as we saw there, that's long lasting and really help transform the area. And crucially, they wanted the ability to challenge proposals, whether that was renewable generation or in this specific case, energy transmission infrastructure, without being told that they were NIMBYs, without being told that they were blockers, words that we've heard time and again from those in power. So, I mean, these are simple demands, but yeah, let's have a look on the next slide as to how we process that. So over the course of this period of, I guess, different types of research, we did a series of things. We ran focus groups with More in Common, actually, across that kind of north-south line. We did storytelling and journalism in key locations. We did a citizens panel, which went far deeper than the focus groups and was specifically weighted not just to people from those key areas, but also towards people that we knew statistically might be more likely to oppose. So we were really looking for a range of views, and particularly views that reflected the kind of outcry that we're seeing in the papers. And we also did an expert panel where we fed those findings directly into transmission operators, policymakers, people like CPRE, and Chris, who was in that video, actually sat on that expert panel. And what we were as a journalist, my element, what we were struck by initially was how hard it was, and this quote shows it, to try and bring a range of voices out through the media where these things were happening in local areas. Without fail, our journalists, including myself, did meet people and did hear from people who weren't necessarily against these developments, but certainly didn't want to say so in public. And I think that's really key, because we're maybe seeing a kind of an unbalanced view through public channels to what's actually happening on the ground. So what we wanted to do was build this different type of conversation that went far beyond just straight up journalism. Two things really: it's high stakes, the urgent need to develop the grid. You know, it's down south they're facing a heat wave. We need to change the way we power our world, but also that urgent need to work fairly with people living alongside it. And you can see from these headlines, if you want to go back onto that slide, thanks, Ruth, just where that jeopardy is. There's 2 public inquiries either confirmed or taking place as we speak around transmission lines in Scotland. One Spittal to Beauly in the Highlands, and one the Kintor to Teeling line down the Aberdeenshire and Angus line. And we can see that so many community kind of campaigns, outcries, objections happening all along that line. So there's a lot happening, and a lot potentially at risk if this isn't done properly. Next slide. Trying to keep up my slides with Ruth's, sorry. So I think what was striking about the work that we did, and there's a lot more to it, you can go online, the link's there, you can find out a lot more, was the kind of way that people were able to process their thoughts on this subject in different parts of the process. In the closed focus groups, people who were either really for or really against didn't really shift from that position. They gave lots of good input and good views, but they stayed very much within their lane, I guess. But over the course of that longer citizen panel piece of work that we did with Climate Guide, which all of us within the team sat in on, people were really able to find a space to unpack their views and think about, oh, I didn't actually think about how the power to my hairdryer comes from a kind of grid line far away, or, oh, I didn't realise that there were community benefits available, or, oh, I didn't even know that shared ownership was a thing. So there was so much more space for people within themselves, not being told by us, to examine those ideas and think about it. And as a result of that process, we kind of sorted the participants into 4 rough groups. The smallest of those groups was an immovable group, that group that were like, no, I do not want it. Right, nothing will change my mind. I do not want this to happen in my area. Interestingly, that was the smallest, which doesn't necessarily tally with what we're seeing in the public domain in terms of outcry in the media. The other 3 groups were interesting in that we kind of roughly classified them as power to the people. So people who felt it was unfair to see these transmission upgrades happening if they didn't get a meaningful say in that development. These groups are most aligned with appetites for public ownership, so linking back into what More in Common did and Our Power are doing now. Second group, pressing reasons to act, were supportive of these upgrades in the national interest. They could see the bigger picture. They were thinking about their kids and their grandkids, and they were seeing the kind of reason that we need to upgrade the grid and the way we power our country. But they did want a stake, and they didn't want to be done to. They still wanted to be an actor in that process. And then property pragmatism, these people were much more, I guess, transactionally motivated, and they wanted that immediate recompense for the disruption at household level, whether that was house prices, whether that was a kind of nominal sum. And we looked quite in detail about what was already on offer and how that needed to be improved. So there's a lot in that. Feel free to go online and read more. The final slide. So yeah, this is just a glimpse. Feel free to ask for more. But for me, um, I think the biggest takeaway was finding that space in between, finding that middle ground where people were able to think um, without the kind of surround sound of toxicity and polarization, without the kind of anger. Think really about what this was all about and whether there was room for flexibility and nuance. We weren't looking for a consensus with this work, but within the process, that nuance was found, and that space for pragmatism came out. And certainly, like anecdotally, people in my groups are saying, "Oh, I didn't know this. Oh, actually, maybe I'll look at it differently now." Um, and like Barbara said at the end there, once they had the information, it's never going to be 100% a rosy picture, but they began to see a way through. So I guess my question to you guys is, how can we replicate these conditions? And I know there's people on this webinar who are already doing work in that area and doing similar things where they're trying to kind of open that space. How can we allow that space for pragmatism to emerge? Because this is not an issue that's going to go away. So yeah, over to you. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Claire. Yeah, and definitely something to, yeah, we'll open up that discussion in the Q&A. Really brilliant to bring in these voices that often get either missed in conversation or just like dismissed as NIMBYs. Yeah, so really brilliant to hear that. We're now gonna hear from Rowan Aitchison for our final speaker from Uplift, who will talk us through the new Our Power campaign and how public and community ownership is fundamental to building an energy system for people, not private profit. Rowan, over to you.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here. And yeah, today I'll be speaking about Our Power, which is a new campaign about public ownership and what that might look like in Scottish context. So Our Power is a new campaign. It's a coalition between several organisations in Scotland. It's a devolved campaign, so it's looking at Scottish policies that might help towards this goal. We're working with communities, workers, and organisations to raise the ambition of the next government, which is just entering Holyrood. We're going to do that through, well, firstly, I'll go through some of the ways that we see public ownership happening. So, as you might know, public ownership in Scotland, we have some of the best resource for wind in particular. There's a huge opportunity with the renewable energy industry, and we're on the cusp of this massive build out of particularly offshore wind, which will form the biggest chunk of our energy generation. At the moment, Scotland has about 3 gigawatts of offshore wind operational, and about 40 gigawatts in the pipeline, either through planning or in development. And to put that into perspective, 40 gigawatts is bigger than the built capacity of Europe at the moment for offshore wind. So it's a huge increase. Now, the good news is that 12% of that through the new ScotWind leasing will be publicly owned, with the profits going to fund essential public services. The bad news is that the public services that those will be funding are in other European countries that have public energy already and have bought the licenses in ScotWind. So 0% of that is going to be publicly owned by Scotland, the new 30 gigawatts of offshore wind. So we're missing out effectively in a big way. And the remaining 88% of the leaseholds of the new offshore wind developments are all either major fossil fuel companies or large finance corporations, which are increasingly turning the millionaires into billionaires. And that is not the direction of travel that we hope to see in Scotland. So some of the solutions to that look like community ownership. community ownership is the most local level of ownership. It's well trodden path in Scotland, with communities building their own wind turbines, hydro, and increasingly solar as well. Some research on the benefits from community ownership versus a commercial developer paying community benefit payments at a rate of £5,000 per megawatt is that if you own the renewable energy generator yourself, then you get 35 times more income to the community than accepting community benefit payments, which is a huge difference, not 34%, 34 times more benefit to communities. And a great example of that is in Shetland, where the largest onshore wind farm in Europe was built, Viking Wind Farm. It's got 443 megawatts, and the community benefit payments are slightly less than the benefit payments or the benefit felt by the community of Bressay, which is an island in Shetland that has one 0.9, so 900 kilowatt turbine that is community owned. So the single turbine on Bressay is paying more to the community than the whole of the Viking Wind Farm. So that's a really stark contrast. And the total community ownership of onshore wind in Scotland is less than 1%. So there's a long way to go there at the moment. I think the largest contrast is what communities decide to do with the wealth that's generated from these wind turbines that are community owned. Instead of big corporations that pay CEO bonuses and shareholders dividends, communities are building social housing, alleviating some fuel poverty through direct payments in some cases on the Outer Hebrides. They're running out of hours ferry services. On Bressay, actually, that's what they're spending their money on, is a link to Lerwick over out of hours timings. And then in the Outer Hebrides again, they're planting thousands of trees through a program with crofters. So it's all things that are bringing huge social benefit to the places that these projects are happening. Another way of organising public ownership is through municipal ownership of energy. This is a completely normal concept in the rest of Europe. There are some fantastic examples in the Nordic countries, in Germany, but very little happens in Scotland. In fact, our local authorities are being hollowed out by austerity and becoming less and less able to provide the social services that we need. But there are places that are looking to change that. So Orkney Island Council are building 3 wind farms, 6 turbines each, that are going to be entirely community owned, entirely council owned, local authority owned, to a capacity of 80 megawatts total. And their calculations at the moment are suggesting that about £5.5 million will be earned from these 3 wind farms every year, and that the turbines will be there for 30 plus years. So that's a huge uplift in terms of council spend, and would facilitate them to keep struggling services open or to increase the amount of services or the type of services that they are able to provide. And interestingly, very little pushback through planning as well for those wind farms that are publicly owned, who people can see the benefit coming down the road. The other way that we can create benefits are through manufacturing the wind turbines themselves. This is a slightly bigger challenge than municipal or community ownership, but nevertheless something that we should be pushing towards. Lots of our installed wind turbine capacity has come from overseas, mostly through China. The jobs that are available for building out wind turbines are all front-loaded, mostly in the build of the kit on the ground. But the longer-term jobs are in manufacturing of the kits themselves. So we're pushing for more wind turbine manufacturing to be done in Scotland, and for that to be backed by the government through public ownership or public stakes in those companies that are doing that manufacturing. And we're hoping to do those through these demands. So it's just outlining the campaign's demands, which are around a route map for community ownership, local authority ownership being financed, 20% stake in offshore wind, and then establishing a community wealth fund, guaranteeing unionised jobs in the renewables industry, and building a publicly led manufacturing base. And we're doing that with all these partners under the umbrella of Our Power, including Platform there. And this is just a bit more about how we hope to achieve that through conveying a really simple message, supporting a strong grassroots network, and creating public pressure, which turns into political pressure to push public ownership into the Scottish Government's programme for government, and then latterly policy changes. So that's all from me on Our Power. But yeah, very happy to take questions at the end. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Rowan. That was brilliant. Great. So we've had 3 different presentations on kind of quite different aspects, overlapping of the energy system and this big question of ownership control. I want to now open the conversation out to questions from everyone here. So if you have a question, you can put your hand up, I think, or just unmute yourself and ask a question. Or if you'd prefer, please write your questions in the chat, and I'll read them out. Feel free to address your questions to like someone specifically, or to everyone. And also feel free to just share general reflections as well. We had a couple of I don't know if they're actually here, but we had a couple of sign-ups from industry and local authorities as well. I can't actually see anyone's name, sadly. But if you are one of those groups as well as anyone else, yeah, I'd love to hear your reflections on anything that's been shared. If no one has a question to begin with, I have some questions lined up to kick us off. If that is okay, great. Cameron, I'll start with you. I was really interested in that near to last slide that you shared on voting intentions. Essentially, you were saying that Reform voters are more in favour of public ownership than some Labour voters, which was really interesting to me. Have More in Common done any research, any more research on this, or have you come across other research that sort of reflects this? Does this generally fit with the pattern that you're seeing? Obviously, we did this research back in January, February, and a lot has happened since then. And kind of what do you think this means for campaigning on public ownership or speaking and on this issue? How should we be framing these arguments around ownership to bring potential Reform voters on side?
Yeah, thank you, Fleck. So yeah, we have lots. I think Reform are a right-wing party, right? And I think people assume that means their voters hold traditional right-wing views. And on something like privatization versus public ownership, maybe you'd expect them to lean more to privatization then. But it's actually really interesting that they don't. But you are still seeing that same split fall out, that assumption with traditional Conservatives. So that split still exists in how you'd imagine it, but obviously Reform voters are a bit different. And that's because Reform have essentially brought together kind of a new voting coalition, or coalesced a voting coalition that maybe last was 2019 with Boris Johnson. They aren't your typical Conservative voters. They're people that also might lean left more economically. And we saw that in the local elections last month, where Reform did really well in those areas across the Red Wall and kind of swept all the council seats there. And when we looked at those and analysed them, they're deprived areas where people are really struggling to get a good paying job. So if you do want to speak to them and kind of sell this to them, this public ownership, that's how you can tie it into there's jobs available in this, and we're going to help lower your bills and get an impact on the cost of living there. And it can work. I mean, like Andy Burnham just won a seat in Makerfield, which demographically at the start, if it wasn't Andy Burnham, everyone would say that should go to reform in what we saw in the local elections. And yet he won it. And one of the policies that he was kind of one of the few policies he was quite open on was that he might back public ownership in the end. So it's not saying he can't take them along. You can't win reform voters over on this. And actually, I think it's interesting what unites reform and green voters is they're really pissed off with the system and want radical solutions that are going to improve the country. And they're not afraid to tear the system down and start again. And if that is public ownership and it's going to lead to results for them, then they're going to support it. They're up for radical change. And if this is it, they'll be, as long as you're seeing the benefits and it helps them economically and with jobs in the area, I think that's how you can campaign on it and bring them forward.
Thanks, Cameron. Really interesting. Yeah, lots to reflect on there. Kenny has a question. I also see Kenny has an Our Power poster in his background that he is beautifully displaying. Kenny, what's your question?
Yeah, so my background is the reason I've got this poster here is I was invited to the launch event by Connor Watt. So Connor interviewed me a long time ago when I was a spokesperson for Just Stop Oil, and he was doing work for Platform I think he was still a student then. But at that time, I was an ex-oil and gas worker that became an environmental activist and was basically recruited originally by Friends of the Earth to be a spokesperson for the Just Transition movement for oil workers, which didn't work out well for me. Speaking to the red flag from a green flag when I was formerly a red flag, it's just a shouting shop. It's just an argument. It's just a big bun fight. And the same people stay in power and control. And that's kind of where my question is now, that if you look behind me here, I am now the chairman, chief cook and bottle washer, sustainability manager of a little community centre. And when I say little, I mean on governmental scale, it's little. As far as the Scottish government goes, there's 1,422 village halls like us that are community owned. And those 1,422 village halls are struggling to meet net zero and zero waste targets. So I need lots of help, but I am voiceless and powerless and feel extremely alone in the world. So when I get my invite to go to the launch of Our Power, I'm right behind it 100%. I am Scottish, not British. That makes me a traitor, a Scottish traitor in the eyes of the people. So we've got more in common in here. So you'll see this poster here. This is when we held the Joe Cox More in Common event here at the Hub. And we had serious concerns of the security it's a very right-wing community. I have done the test. It's a very excellent test that More in Common have to see which segment you are. So
where are you, Kenny?
No surprise that I am
Progressive
12%. But the 20% were a genuine fear to us at that event because I come from that background. I was a working class kid that grew up and got a job in the oil industry. My brothers went to the military. That was your option as a Scottish kid, military or factory. Now, my question with being so alone in the world is that I'm trying to produce films and everything. I'm changing the energy over here, and I'm fighting the system. So when I've been attending seminars, etc., for Community Energy Scotland, Local Energy Scotland, Business Energy Scotland, all of these things. I attend seminars and conferences all the time. I am always the only unpaid volunteer at these events that has experience on not only working for international energy firms and how you create energy to make profit for international firms. I'm also experienced in home energy. I have a home in Bulgaria. The system there is different. The heat and power knowledge that I have almost seems to be ignored when some of the stuff that gets said by people that are employed to be advisors don't really know that it's just a job and they're just delivering something that they've got not a lot of knowledge on.
Kenny, I'm gonna slightly cut just because of time, just because of
Yes,
time.
of course. Yeah, I totally understand. The question that I do have is like, we do all need to come together. And just now, I thought that when our power launched, that there was going to be somebody coming. Right, here we go. We're going to battle GB energy because that's the enemy. So, how do we join together? How do we collaborate? How do I get help?
It's a great question. Think I might throw that over to Rowan to talk a little bit about our power plans, as well as like just the different levels that we're operating as well. It sounds like, Kenny, you're doing an amazing, I mean, I know the Parliament Community Hub, it's doing amazing work. You yourself are doing incredible work. And I know that you're in touch with Community Energy Scotland. If there are other energy projects on here who are looking for resources, Community Energy Scotland is also a brilliant resource. But Rowan, do you want to share some reflections on what Kenny said?
Yeah, thanks, Kenny. I appreciate it. And I appreciate the struggle of being in an unpaid role in a community, because that's where I've come from, I guess, is community energy and trying to get projects off the ground. So there's the classic advice of Community Energy Scotland and Local Energy Scotland through the CARES programme providing some kind of funding, which doesn't fit everyone's situation. But if you can get access to that funding, then you can start building out renewables. And in my view, renewables are the key to all other community development because it provides a passive income that is fairly stable. And over the long term, you can build core funding off that income. And then with core funding, you can have a member of staff. And with a member of staff, you can attract other funding. So that's, in my head, the model that should be working for Scottish communities. The best bit, I think, about going up one level, doing something on a larger scale, say shared ownership of a wind farm or larger collaborations between different community groups on owning a whole wind farm, is that you then get more money. And the more money you have, the more power you have, and the more power you can have over building solutions that fit your community specifically, because that's what we need, is really, really local solutions from local people. Yeah, I think that's probably all I've got to add at the moment. But yeah, good luck.
Thanks so much. And I see that, Claire, you have added Kenny about potentially chatting more about the Parliament Community Hub. Brilliant. There's a couple more questions in the chat. We've got about 4 minutes left, and I want to wrap this up by 2. Maybe I'll ask both of these questions in turn, and then folk can pick them up. This is probably more aimed at Rowan, but actually it like interesting as well, Claire, your perspective on this. What's your link up with land reform campaign groups? How does this issue overlap? And then Ria Tonks has written, Rowan, how far along is the Our Power campaign? What's the traction like? I'm aware of Community Energy Scotland campaigns, but was unaware of this campaign, which is exactly what Scotland needs. Interesting and frustrating to hear the breakdown of information about ScotWind and the money being used to fund public services. How do we change that narrative?
Happy to jump in on both of those. Land reform is another thing that I have a huge passion for. It goes hand in hand with community ownership of renewable energy. You have to have land to build renewables on the very smallest scale. So if you want to put up, say, ground-mounted solar, it's by far the most ideal scenario to own the field that you're putting it in. It just makes everything so much easier. And we know that on the very opposite end of the spectrum, the people who own the majority of land in or rural land in Scotland are benefiting massively from the private sector doing renewable rollout because they get paid rent, and that's often higher than the community benefit payments that are paid to the communities that live near the wind farms. So at the moment, it's increasing the inequality of resources going to people who already have ownership of the main asset, which is land, or the main limited asset. So that's, yes, there's so much further to go. The best example is on the Outer Hebrides, where most of the land is community owned now. They built their own little wind farm with 3 turbines, and over the last decade, it's made something like £8.8 million for the community around Point and Sandwich. So when land is in community ownership, then the benefits flow back to the community. The how far along is the Our Power campaign? It's getting there. It's not fully out in the world and making all the changes we hope it will, but those are in the works. And if you sign up to our newsletter on the website, ourpower.org, then you'll see when we've got actions coming up, things you can get involved with. And there is quite a lot of traction there from politicians. There's a lot of interest. I think it's the benefit of being a coalition campaign. And yeah, it's one to watch at the moment. Hopefully it'll only build in momentum.
Thanks so much, Claire. Do you want to come in and share
just on the narrative point, how do we change the narrative? And I guess that's in part why Our Power is here. And I do think on a broader level, it's about simplifying. We were chatting about this earlier. The energy system is complex, and we certainly found that through the kind of deep dive work we did. Sadly, you can't afford complex messaging and complex campaigns at this stage of the game. So I think we as a sector need to find a way to tell these stories really simply, talk about the potential gains really clearly and really simply, keep talking about them, and go back to what Cameron was saying about the political landscape. There are lots of good examples to follow from those in certain parties on super simple, consistent messaging. So I think it's on us really to find ways to shift that narrative in a way that everyone can latch onto.
Thank you so much. Cameron, did you have 30 seconds of just a reflection, and then I'll wrap it up?
Yep, I think thank you. It's been really interesting to hear from Rowan and Claire today as well. My main thing would be the thing that comes up again and again and again is the cost of living at the minute, and what you can do to tie that into that will help give this campaign success, and how you can help people and help you bring them along with you. But thank you. This was really useful and interesting to hear.
Thanks. Yeah. Food for thought there on the cost of living, definitely. All right, folks, thank you very much. Thanks to Rowan, to Claire, and to Cameron for those brilliant presentations. And thanks for everyone for coming on an incredibly warm day. I mean, it's a balmy 20 degrees in Argyll, but I hear it's a bit hotter down south. We will follow up with a few links to the report to a couple of reports that Claire shared, also the research analysis and results that Cameron was talking through, and we'll also give you some links to the Our Power website. The thing to do is to go to ourpower.scot and sign up for the newsletter, and you will then get updates and our calls to action later on in the year. Thank you very much again for attending, and have a great rest of this very warm week. Bye bye.